Hi everyone, thank you for joining. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Thanks a lot for joining us today. My name is Maor Franco. I'm part of the product team over here at Pantera, and if you can check the picture, we're going to talk cyber today. I'm not going to steal your skateboard or something. Today is a very interesting topic that's very precious and dear to my heart. I hope that by the end of the session, we'll be on the same page of how we're going to look at the attack surface and what does it mean to us. How can we find not just the assets we have, not just the vulnerabilities, but those that are exploitable, that can really create the impact, and how we can go ahead and prevent it ahead of time. Let's make it a fun webinar. I want to make it as interactive as possible. We're going to have some poll questions, but the one thing I really want to ask is ask questions. You have the Q&A tab at the bottom. Ask me questions as I go. I'll try to mingle, but if you see my brain freeze for a second and I shut up, I'm a man. I can only do one thing at a time, but I'll try to interact with those questions. So without further ado, the topic of today is 4 steps to knowing your exploitable attack surface. And I promise that by the end of the session, I'll explain to you what I mean by that, and everything will be on the right step to knowing that. Let's continue. Before we dive in to what is an attack surface, let's get on the same page. And I put this dictionary explanation from NIST of how they defined attack surface. And you guys can read it. The set of points on the boundary of a system element, or an environment where an attacker can try to enter, cause an effect on, or extract data from that system. That's a mouthful. In my world, let's try to simplify it. Attack surface is how we define it here at Pantera, and I would like to ask for your opinion in just a minute, is everything that the adversary is able to compromise so that they can meet their objective. Let's give a couple of examples. Let's look first on the internal infrastructure. What do we have here today with it, whether it's on-premise or your cloud environment that's are behind and no one can access, what we used to call inside the perimeter. All the endpoints, whether it's your workstations, your servers, your switches, your routers, your firewalls, any asset that you have inside your organization. Second thing is all of your networks, all of your subnets, depends on how you build it, whether it's the Wi-Fi, whether it's the DMZ, all the network you have in place. That's one thing. In my world, this is the attack surface, and I would like to ask for your advice in just a minute, whether you include that as well. Second aspect of the attack surface is everything that's exposed externally. And I gave here a couple of examples, such as the domain name, acme.org, the subdomains, the IPs, the networks, services, website, you name it. So in my world, and I want to make sure that as we go through the webinar, it is important for me to highlight that when we think of attack surface, it is not just an asset that's available in my internal system that the phishing might go and hit one day. It's not just an external exposed web application that some malicious adversary might be able to try and compromise and gain access in. It is everything that stands in face of the adversary to try and exploit and take advantage of so they can meet their objective. Now, before I move in, I actually want to go and ask you, is this resonating with you? And we have the first poll questions of this webinar. And I want to understand the attack surface. What does it mean to you? And while you're answering, I'll take a couple of seconds for that. I want to know, I already also had this same exact poll questions on LinkedIn, and I want to share with you the results of that as well, about what does it mean to you when you think attack surface, because this will be a fundamental element as we go through the webinar today of understanding how can we identify the exploitable attack surface. I already see you're filling those up, whether it's anything publicly, internal assets, option 1 or 2, or everything. I think we got sufficient results. Thank you for your participation, highly appreciated. Let's go ahead and see the results. Very interesting. I see that almost 90% mentioned that the approach we talk about attack surface is aligned, whether it's everything and not just anything exposed publicly. And the reason why I wrote everything is because many times people tell me, but what about the identity? Is the identity included in the attack surface as well? In my opinion, yes, because it's social engineering. It's how can I go and fake the identity and use a benign credentials to be able to get in? I'm a legitimate user using legitimate way of accessing an organization, laterally moving through a benign credentials. So thank you for this. And I also want to share that this is the same exact answers that I got when I asked this over LinkedIn. So just we're all aligned here. And this was important for me to highlight. And I'm very happy with what I've just seen. Now let's continue. I want to give you this stat. Pivot a little bit to the external attack surface for a second. ESG research just published that 7 out of 10 organizations, almost 70%, admit that they've experienced at least one cyber attack that started through an exploitation of an unmanaged or poorly managed internet-facing asset. Now, I don't know if this resonates with you and your organization, whether you've seen that in the past. But one of the questions that I've asked that important to me too, why is that happening now more than X years before? Why is the external attack surface more, gain more ways for the adversary to exploit and use it for malicious reasons? 3 reasons. Let's talk about the first one. The perimeter is dead. We all acknowledge that, especially for the past 3 years with COVID in our life, when everyone's accessing from anywhere, everywhere from any device. And there's more IT connection to third parties because that's the way our business operates. And that breaks the silo, especially if you're in a defense in-depth zero trust type of a network. All of a sudden you have too many things accessing and removing content from your environment. That's one reason. Second reason is environment are heterogeneous. The diversity of the devices, whether it's specific types of mobile devices, whether it's workstations, whether it's servers, whether it's domain controllers, whether it's cloud containers, whether it's workload, it's very different. It's not like we had, again, I look back 10 years ago and I'll do a little bit of a, news from the past and how it relates to how it is today. And this is one major impact. Third is public cloud. The greater use of public cloud infrastructure, PaaS, infrastructure as a service, you name it, introduces a lot of complexity. A lot of companies that are currently in this hybrid state, as well as companies that are only cloud or only on-prem, but the majority of us are in this hybrid state because the business see that as a value, and security needs to be an enabler for that business. And how those additional adoption helps us and changes the attack surface. That's important to highlight. Let's continue. Now, before we go to the more identifying of the attack surface, I want to make sure that we're on the same page regarding the key challenges that we're seeing by the growing attack surface. It's going to be a couple of me being in the cynical slides, but again, I already see a couple of questions in the Q&A, which I'll address in just a minute, but keep on pushing those questions. I want to see if what I'm saying resonates with you and you're seeing it on a daily basis. So first thing, I've never met a defender that assumed that they know all of their assets, all of their attack surface, bulletproof. I know everything. Even though they're using an asset management, a glorified CMDB, a next-gen cyber asset attack surface management, no one is really confident that they understand the full attack surface. So I think that what the point I'm trying to make here is that the first thing, the underlying proof needs to be, first thing is visibility. It is not the goal. We need to see the attack surface the same way as the adversary sees us and not what we think and where we have a control in place or an agent deployed to be able to tell us how this asset is behaving. But all of the assets out there, the same ones the adversary may exploit. Let's continue. Another key challenge around the attack surface is the endless focus on vulnerabilities. I put up this number here. More than 20,000 new vulnerabilities were added in 2021 alone. More than 20,000 vulnerabilities. That number is just massive. So when the world tells us, oh, there's a new vulnerability, criticality is high, and you need to be patch perfect, this is where we fall flat. The organization says we need to find all the vulnerabilities, but at the end of the day, I don't need 30,000 more vulnerabilities. I need to find a way to identify which of these vulnerabilities can take my organization down and put it on the front page. Which one should I focus on first? Let's continue. We said discovery of the assets of the attack surface inside and outside the organization, everything that's exposed to the public web and everything that's behind the firewall. Go beyond vulnerabilities, which we are dealing with day in, day out. But another challenge that I see when we work with our customers is I recently implemented this add your 3-letter alphabet soup. So now we are ready. And you can put here, this detection and response. For exposed asset, you can talk about web application firewall, you name it. But the one key problem we're seeing is that we've implemented it today. IT infrastructure is changing on a daily, weekly basis. How did we validate that with all those continuous changes, that objective that we had for that control actually holds water in reality beyond that point in time on a continuous basis? That's a question that as we think about the attack surface and how we're protecting against that from two aspects, from a prevention point of view, stopping at the gate, or be able to identify if something has happened so your blue team can take action in seeing that and detection and responding to that fast. This is one of the key things. Just simply implementing a control doesn't actually increase readiness level. Number 4, no need to realize impact and risk. We have CVSS. This one I love the most. For the past years, we've been religiously focusing on the CVSS score and how that implied on the prioritization of us patching. If I have, let's speak on Log4j, which I'm going to talk a little bit during this webinar. If Log4j now gave me the 10 score because of remote code execution, that means that I need to stop everything and only focus on Log4j vulnerabilities from a patching perspective. However, is that true? Maybe 80% of those Log4j vulnerabilities using the library, but you can't really exploit it because you put the controls in place to be able to avoid that LDAP or other fuzzer execution and exploiting that vulnerability. And you have other vulnerabilities that are lower on the CVSS criticality that actually the adversary will use because that's their way in to go below detection radars. My point here is saying that the CVSS on its own is not the end goal. It is a great indicator to help us evaluate the full solution and full prioritization. But this is a key challenges that right now, for the past year, we've been preaching and telling organizations worldwide, look at the CVSS, focus on the X number of critical assets and patch. So we had discovery, vulnerability, controls that you think you put in place, and you have prioritization. Now let's talk about, at the end of the day, the end goal. How can we eliminate the risk? And if there's one thing that I'm sure we're all in this, again, this is very cynical, is one of the key challenges that we have today when you're looking at exposures and vulnerability and attack surface and readiness and resiliency. Prioritizing remediation is definitely not easy. This is the key. Once we found everything, all the assets, once we found all the vulnerabilities, once we validated whether the controls will be able to meet their objectives and prevent or detect it, we can now understand from an adversary point of view what will be their possible impact and go all the way to the root vulnerability and focus the remediation and actually know how to do that. But above all here, one of the key challenges that we see is that we did remediate. But how do we know now if the remediation we put in place actually solved the problem? We patched this server. Have we really patched it? How many times did we have multiple patches? But we haven't really did solve the problem, whether it's misconfigurations that were just introduced, even though the patch was implemented. Which brings me to the next point. One of the key indicators that I believe are a couple of the most important metrics we should look at as we're on this race to harden our environment and patch it before the adversary has their attempt to go ahead and exploit a discovered vulnerability or one that is yet to be discovered. I want to give you two indicators. And again, I'm looking at the chat. I see a couple coming in. I'll address it in just a minute. Two indicators. One of them is the exposure dwell time. Now, with all our friendly defenders here on the line, I'm sure that we're all on the same page to what dwell time means. The time the adversary was able to get into the organization through many ways he has in their arsenal and ways they can get in, infiltrate or exfiltrate, till the time it was detected. Now, we know from the Verizon Data Breach Report that's published every year that that number is not comforting. It is in the month, not in the hours, minutes, or days. Now, it is getting better with the years, but the complexity of the attack surface simply does not let it go down to where we need it to be. So now let's look at it not from the adversary point of view in my environment. Let's look at the exposure. When the length of time exposure exists, and when I say exposure, let's get on the same page, a vulnerability, a misconfiguration, an asset that's exposed that I can use, a leaked credentials, you name it, that now provides the adversary way to abuse my organization. Let's continue. Second is the time to exploit. The time the adversary has from when a vulnerability was identified, again, whether disclosed or not just publicly, those publicly disclosed, to when it was actually exploited by the adversary. And for that, I want to show you, walk through a diagram of why I think these two indicators, metrics are critical for us to start evaluating when we think exploitable attack surface. As the exposure dwell time, the optimal state is never like, okay, I have an exposure, I patch it immediately. It's never the case. But we all understand that if we look at the approach that we've been doing today, when you're using your yearly, bi-yearly pen testing approach to be able to validate your attack surface and implement those adversary tactics against your environment to see how vulnerable you are and what can the adversary accomplish, let's assume for a minute that once that test completed, you're by yourself till the next time that team comes in and potentially do that siloed on that specific subnet. Let's assume. That results in a reality that exposures being out there, leaving the adversary a lot more time to actually exploit that. And that is a major problem. How we need to realize that the longer the exposure exists, the time to exploit on the adversary side is getting much bigger without us even knowing that. So if I look at those two together and how we're measuring the attack surface, that helps me to understand that a simple discovery of asset doesn't get me to where I need to be. Knowing vulnerabilities on those assets is not the end goal. It helps me to identify vulnerable assets. But when I'm looking at how can that be exploited by the adversary, the time they have, the potential risk and impact from that exploitation and post-exploitation attempts when they're already inside my organization, this is the key. Now, let's see of how we can start knowing our exploitable attack surface. We talked about 4 steps, and I'll show you in a second. There are more steps here, but how do we categorize it so you can think in a 4-step process? First of all, you need to have initial discovery of your total attack surface. And again, if I go back to my first slide, all the assets I have internal to my organizations, behind the firewall, internal infrastructure, you name it, and everything that's publicly exposed that potentially have a leg in through DMZ to your internal organization. Discovery is a necessity. Second thing is enumeration. It's not enough just to identify an asset. You want to know what asset you're looking at. What is the endpoint? What's the network? What's the context? So now you can evaluate whether the criticality of this asset is higher, what type of asset and what are the odds for that to be used against you. Is that a critical asset or a critical user that may allow the adversary to gain privileged access and laterally move through the organization? This is the context you must have beyond just identifying the assets. And when I say in assets, again, it's I want to make it sure. It's all those domains, IPs, networks, endpoint, everything that the malicious adversary will have in their hands to be able to use against an organization. Third thing, scanning. Once we found that, we know the context, let's start scanning for all those known vulnerabilities. But this is a tricky part. So far, majority of us are maybe doing that across the entire attack surface, but in some of us not. But this is just a step in the right direction. Exposures. I can share with you from Pantera research, which sits day in, day out, you're looking at in-the-wild threats and evaluating the techniques the adversaries are using, is that many times it is not your glorified, CVSS ranked 10 criticality. It is a misconfiguration. It is an asset that you did not have the control on. It is a control, a detection and response or prevention controls that was not configured properly and allowed it to go in without the necessity of alert coming in for the blue teams. So here, it is highly important to go beyond the static vulnerabilities to the dynamic and overall exposures and misconfigurations on that assets that I was able to find on the context that I have against them. So that I can do what? So that I can initiate the exploitation. That's what matters. I want to give you a stats. Remember, I shared just a minute ago about 20,000 new vulnerabilities that were discovered in 2021 alone, out of which less than 5% are actually exploitable. That means that they might be ranked CVSS 10, but there's not an exploit available in the cloud, or there's not a POC code, or there's no proof of any exploitation that can be done without crashing the host to a blue screen of death, which no one wants it, not the defender team and not the adversary, because then they're stuck. So this is where we're starting to look at the funnel and start zeroing in on the exposures that actually matter, the assets that actually matter. Let's continue. Even the exploitation, to what end? So that if you go back to the previous point is so we can start eliminating the problem based on the impact that was able to cause. One of the key things that, when we talk to customers today when they're thinking attack surface, they think about, I found an asset, it is vulnerable. They even took a step further. It is also exploitable. But what's the reach a customer can achieve in that case? Where can it go? Will it be able to access my domain controller and start creating benign credentials so they can go below detection radars? Can they go to my critical assets and start exfiltrate data? Can they launch a ransomware attack? This is the context we start knowing so we can start eliminating with context and priority in a surgical fashion. Now, let's start double clicking to steps. I would like you guys to tell me if you can take actionable steps right after the webinar and start implementing in your organization based on the assets you have, or as a priority as you think about 2022 and what you want to focus on. So when we think about the exploitable attack surface, there must be a shift from an asset inventory as the goal as it is simply a starting point. Again, I just prove it to you, but it's important for me to highlight that just finding the asset is, in an analogy, 30,000 alerts. You have it. Good luck. Your ability to prioritize 30,000 alerts is impossible. Here's 20,000 vulnerabilities. Good luck. So now just adding the number of assets gets you a first step in the right direction, but it is definitely not the goal. Scanning and exposure. Solid view of just known vulnerabilities only provide a partial view of the attack surface exposures. We must shift away from the vulnerability centric because it is failing us. It provides us, yes, more list of vulnerabilities, but it removes from a prioritization and criticality, lower ranked criticality that adversary is using to infiltrate in and laterally move, because they know we're focusing only on the critical ones. So they don't even invest in that because most probably your controls will be able to detect and all of a sudden they're not stealthy anymore. They're using to the medium ones that allow them to chain multiple vulnerabilities and misconfigurations. That silence was I was checking the questions. Apologies. Third step, to shift and actually know your exploitable attack surface. Once a year, a bi-yearly, even a quarterly of evaluating your attack surface from a penetration testing does not imply security readiness. You all know, we all know, no one loves this one-off penetration testing because they create havoc. It's like a post-tsunami pen test. And the output, it takes 3 weeks to generate the report. We only focus on the two most critical. But the quick question I want to ask beyond those hurdles is, what's happening the day after pen test? Network infrastructure has changed. A new vulnerability arises. What is the risk? Should you focus on other priorities? Is the priorities provided were not exploitable, but right now you do have one? That's an important point to take into account. So again, before I jump to the fourth one, we talked about the discovery enumeration. Shift from an asset inventory as the goal to merely a starting point. Scanning and exposure, not just a point in time, not just a partial view of the attack surface. Whether it's your internal assets or external, doesn't matter. You need to think about it holistically, end to end. Or an actual exploitation and what can the adversary achieve. And if I focus on the elimination part, elimination of that risk, a risk that was proven to you based on how the attack surface was exploitable and what would the adversary can achieve. We need to understand that this patch whack-a-mole, a first come, first served, FIFO, LIFO, whatever approach that you want to take based on the CVSS or any other metric that you have in place, without embedding the adversary way of operation, what the adversary may look as asset as an attractive for multiple reasons, does not help us reduce cybersecurity risk. And I'm going to go to how we see it and how we build this in just a minute, because this is where I want to shift from, okay, we talked about the problems. We talked about the key challenges. We talked about of how am I even able to know my exploitable attack surface, and not just asset inventory, glorified vulnerability, additional vulnerabilities, or penetration testing that I'm doing every once in a while. And how can I go about eliminating that? But how you can start doing that today. Now, before I jump into how we do it, I want to ask you another question, please. We talked about all those key challenges, and I want to know if these are resonating with you. And as you're looking at this, I also am going to take a quick sneak peek on the Q&A to the questions, and I already have a great question. I see a couple of questions on the attack techniques that you're probably asking already about Pantera. We're not there yet. I know you're anxious to hear about what we do to help you with the exploitable attack surface. I'll touch on all the techniques and how we move laterally in just a minute. So that's a great point. And there was a reference here to Gartner around where do we fit in. I'll touch on that in just a minute as well. So great point. Some of us, care about what, the industry analysts are saying about us. So I'll definitely more than happy to share about this with you. Now, I'll give you 5 more seconds. I already see that we have large, poll of people that's answered. I really appreciate that. If you can go ahead and give us the results. Okay, let's look at it. First of all, 7% that got it covered. I think it's amazing. You guys are ahead of the curve. And this is the path to go. And I actually want to learn from you of how you do it, how you're successful, what are the processes you put in place and how you're doing it. So feel free to reach out to me offline or put stuff in the chat to kind of get us going from a conversation to benefit other attendees to the webinar. But I see that about 70% or about, actually, no, if I include the 3, 90%, and that's the one thing I get a lot. It's that confidence level of I think I'm covered against the vulnerability. It's difficult to pinpoint. This is where we see the majority of the struggle. And that brings me to a different slide that talks about we have to change the approach. If we look at what we've been doing for the past 20 years, we've been focusing on penetration testing, on vulnerability scanning, and that definitely improved where we are today. But that is not the end goal. The same way, and this kind of quote here that I abused just a little bit. We always say that the threat landscape evolved. The adversary sophistication is getting better. Their ability, their arsenal of tools is getting better. But we're using the same tools and approach, expecting different results. And that's something that I want to start challenging. And I want to give you, following this slide, I want to take you back. 2017. For those of you who are probably as old as me, remember the Equifax breach. This was a major event in the industry, alongside other that took place that time, whether it's the Home Depot, Target, many others. But for me, Equifax was a major event. And I want to walk through the flow that happened there. I have a point, I promise. In March 2017, the US CERT disclosed a new Apache Strats 2 remote code execution vulnerability, 2017-5638. Does it ring a bell just a little bit, Apache? Let's continue. What happened less than a month after? Attackers started reconning Equifax external attack surface. Once they found it, they started scanning for that specific vulnerability. And they took action to exploit it and start mapping of how they can use it as infiltration, exfiltration route. And they did it more than 30 times, creating that backdoor, planting web shells anywhere they can possibly do. Now, is that different? Is that that way that you guys are shocked? Not at all. But the speed of how the adversary was able to pick it up is fast. Now, if you look at the report, Equifax knew about that vulnerability, knew about that asset, but they could not take any action because they did not realize the impact. And once the adversary was able to get in and expand into the organization as deep as one as they could towards meeting their objectives, you kind of know where the story goes. Now, why am I sharing this 2017 Equifax breach? Because that's a great example of how a complete visibility to your entire attack surface and understanding how the malicious adversary operate is critical to understand. Now, let me fast forward 2021, Q4, just about a month ago. I know it still hurts sitting down. Let's talk about Log4Shell and ransomware. Tell me if it sounds familiar. December 9th, 2021, Apache disclosed new Log4j2 remote code execution vulnerability. 2021 44228. We'll probably remember that number for a very long time. What's happening in days after? Attackers starting reconning the external attack surface to be able to find a way to get in. Once reconning, they try to scan for that vulnerability on every asset and web application out there. After scanning, they start exploiting that and doing the same thing of mapping environment, doing that for every asset log4j library exists. To what end? So they can infiltrate in and expand to the organization. But what are we seeing right now in the field, in the wild, is that it's not potentially targeted for specific organizations for the majority part. Yes, there are cases that we're seeing. They are triggering ransomware attack, process injection, execute payload, encrypting files, you know ransomware, and you know the rest. Log4Shell, as long as Sprint Nightmare, as long as any other MS Exchange vulnerability is now into the mix of getting a way in, exploiting, and laterally moving into the organization to exploit, and you know the rest. So what do we do with that? I want to talk to you about an approach that thinks holistically end-to-end about a security validation for how we know that we are actually increasing our readiness, increasing our resiliency, because we tested and validated our assets, our controls, the techniques the adversaries are using, and we've proven the impact. Let me walk you through for a second of how I envision this. And again, I'd love to hear from you in the Q&A or chat. Just tell me whether you're already doing it today. First of all, through a cloud-delivered option, how can you go and start discover your asset? Once you discover those assets, and if you remember, I'm talking about the same exact funnel, scan for any vulnerabilities, step in the right direction, not the goal, so that now I can exploit it. So all of a sudden, that funnel decreases a lot because many vulnerabilities simply don't have an approved exploitation. So now I'm focusing, and I'm telling post-exploitation actions where that can take me, so that I now, inside the organization, working the same way as the adversary would if they're not installing agents, and they're doing the same exact actions, the same attack kill chain of discovery, scanning, exploitation, and post-exploitation to meet their goal and progress the attack as far as wide as possible, depends on their objectives. Crimeware, nation state, you name it, kitty cat. So that an impact would be proven. And again, the shift I've done here in this section is not just talking about how the adversary will do that, but how you can do that the same way as the adversary would to prove the impact. Not just guess, not just simulate, this is an hypothesis that I have like you do with threat hunting. Actually prove the potential impact in case an adversary would have done all these steps. But again, you proved it, so what? So that now you can go all the way back and identify the root cause and the full end-to-end of how the adversary was able to get in, and how once is in, they're meeting their objective. Let's speak on ransomware for a second, encrypting the data and exfiltrating the data out so they can, double extort you data. This is the angle. And this is the change in approach that I want to you guys to take it out of this session, you guys and girls. We need to start challenging our defenses the way that the adversary does. Whether it's through the minor attack techniques, whether it's the OWASP top 10, whether everything I can go and challenge my defenses, my attack surface, my blue team processes and incident response, everything that exists in my security program based on knowing the exploitable attack surface. Now, I see questions in the chat whether this session will be recorded. Yes, we'll definitely be able to share this with you offline for those who attended and for those who haven't. So that's a great question. I'm happy you find this helpful. Thanks for that feedback. Now, I know you're probably asking, okay, so why is this a Pantera webinar? I want to share with you that what I just explained, this change in approach, is exactly what Pantera has been doing for the past years, of how we're thinking beyond the traditional approaches of just finding the attack surface, just looking at the vulnerability scanning, just finding exposures, or just trying to exploit and saying check fail on my control. but actually how we're looking at this end-to-end of an outside in, inside out across your attack surface. And let me tell you how we do it. First of all, the first step of how Pantera does it is a discovery of your attack surface, wherever you have that attack surface is on. I said it, I think, 50 times, but it's important for me to highlight. Attack surface is attack surface, whether it's externally exposed assets or your internal infrastructure. The adversary don't care, and therefore we don't care. Once we found and enumerated, and we know the context of those assets, we found all those assets you know, but also the assets you don't know. We talked about at the beginning, nobody thinks they have full visibility. So that now I can go and identify all those exposures and vulnerabilities, the static, but also the dynamic and misconfigurations and everything the adversary will be able to use. To what end? So then Pantera is able to emulate the same technique the adversary is undergoing in a complete autonomous fashion. That means you don't have to do everything. There is no policy tab in Pantera. The way Pantera works is a complete autonomous fashion. Every time it hits an asset, we know how to gain the context and see whether an action can be taken on him. Now, up to you if you want to approve it or not. We gave you this power. And then we can progress the attack and keep on doing that with multiple attack frameworks. Second thing is, everything is happening in real. You're probably asking, so you're actually running exploitation live? Yes, that's what we do. Because we want to give you the full exact picture in a complete safe fashion without any prior knowledge of the network or agents that you need to install or deploy across your infrastructure. Because that's an overhead we do not want to do. That's an action that detection control think and not how the adversary operate. To what end? So that we can tell you, start to finish, if the adversary was found this asset, what actions they would take aligned to the MITRE attack techniques, all the way to the proven impact, so that we can prioritize and remediate that. CVSS is just one indicator on the context, the attractiveness of the assets, the stealthiness, the exfiltration routes, the exploitability, so that we can remove that risk, all the way starting from the root vulnerability. And if I can give you just a simple example of how you would envision of how Pantera does that to your organization in a complete safe fashion to really harden your security program, is from the outside in, whether it's a vulnerability exploitation, OWASP top 10, remote access, an RDP protocol that's exposed, that's misconfigured, the options here, ransomware, phishing, leak credentials, the options to get in are vast. But once you're in, how can you go ahead across the full attack chain, laterally moving, privilege escalations, running malware in a complete safe fashion, encrypting data, and data exfiltration. So you now have this end-to-end security validation. And I have a couple, before I dive in to the demo, which I'm sure you guys want to see, I want to ask you kind of final question because we go there. I talked about a lot about prioritization and remediation based on risk. And if you ask me, that's the end goal. It's same goes for detection response for those of you in the security operation world. How can I go and prioritize the alerts that matter most based on the impact of that asset that an adversary or a malicious activity that I was able to find? This feedback is really important for me to kind of understand from you. Your confidence level in your ability to prioritize and remediate. I'll give us 5 more seconds and then I'm going to go and jump directly to that demo. If we can show the results, that will be great. I have a lot of helpers here. I'm a presenter, but okay, let's see the results. Very confident. That actually resonates with the 7% we had before. I'm very happy with this response. By the way, for those who answered very confident, I want to hear more about that. Please reach out to me, either the Q&A chat, and I'll get back to you. But I see that that's about 80% that don't think they're prioritizing the right vulnerabilities or need help to reduce risk and increase readiness. And that's where the majority of us are at. You're not alone. I want to make sure you're not the island. On the contrary, this is where we are at. This is what we're trying to change. So thank you for that context. Now, Let's go and shift to a quick demo. I'm gonna close my presentation for a second and pivot. So let's talk about a scenario. You start your day and you log into Pantera. You use the two-factor authentication. And again, I'm doing this in real time. Live demo, what can possibly go wrong? Because we want to make sure that everything is connected. You are redirected to the Pantera platform user interface. Immediately, you can see all the domains and assets that we were able to identify for your environment. No actions was required by you. We simply, from the domain, start enriching and doing the discovery and vulnerability scanning phase. This widget also helps you to identify whether the changes you're seeing here are aligned to your change management of how you're doing IT changes infrastructure. All of a sudden, we see a spike. That's something that can help you identify. But the one thing that draw your attention is what Pantera gives you as the top attraction. We see here a potential log4j vulnerability. And once we click in to that, we see multiple servers that we identify that potential log4j attractiveness on. This Apache Tomcat 853 might be an asset that you know or unknown to you. And you see here the URL, an IP address that is associated with this. But why did Pantera even expose this above other assets, above other attractions in a higher priority for you? So because of the attractions that we're able to identify using the discovery, enumeration, scanning, and exposure analysis, we found an unauthorized access option. We found a potential log4j that can potentially be exploited. So again, it's not just the library exists. We actually have a way through a fuzzing to be able to tell you whether that log4j can be exploited or not. Beyond all the assets that we're able to identify, I now want to go ahead and look for that server. And I see that there's indeed a Java instance that we're able to enumerate within that Apache server. And if I look here, we found a vulnerability, but Pantera does not stop here. Where everything stopped, we found the assets, we found the vulnerability, good luck with that. This is where Pantera starts. Over here, you have the full list of all actions and approval to exploitation that you have in your arsenal to go ahead and validate whether that log4j exposure is real one, whether you should be prioritizing that, and what could be the possible impact of that. So if I go ahead and click on this multiple types of tests that I want to start including, I can go ahead and look and go ahead and try to attempt to go and take action against those. As you can see here, I have here all the pending actions we were just provided from that attractions, and I want to go ahead and validate it right now. And immediately Pantera start executing the exploitation attempts and try to progress the attack as much as possible. Which brings me here. Once that exploitation attempts was successfully completed, we see here all the achievements that Pantera was able to gain. And right here at the top with highest risk, but this is not just a CVSS. This is what we were able to accomplish as CVSS as yet another indicator to help me with prioritization. I see here the log4j vulnerability and asset that we found and the context you need and what's the best way to remediate, but also all the information you need about how we exploited that, how our fuzzer was working, exploited that JNDI LDAP exploitation in this case, but many other ways of how we do it. But I want to ask you again here, to what end? What now we have is the adversary way of getting into the environment. Here, I'm pivoting to my internal infrastructure because that specific asset, that Apache server, has a leg into my organization. Now, I want to go and emulate a complete ransomware attack, because based on what we're seeing, that's exactly what's happening in the wild. And I want to know whether my organization is ready for that type of infiltration, lateral expansion, and type of attack operation as a whole, end to end. So as I look here on that specific server that I found is in the same subnet on that external IP now is part of my internal infrastructure. And I'm looking at how can I go ahead and evaluate the ransomware attack. In this case, it's a Conti type of attack. Let's go and double click for a second. What we've done on that specific server that was used to log4j as an entry point now is being used to trigger remote ransomware attack across my organization. How do we do that? We open remote protocol channel, execute code remotely on that host, payload establishing connection, the same way as the adversaries are using ransomware in this case. We're now actually executing the ransomware payload in a complete safe fashion. You're probably saying ransomware is not safe. Before we take any actions, we copy the data. Nothing is happening. There's no interruptions at all to the user side, to that host. We enumerate all the files we found on that host, all the files that may be potentially, and you can decide which files. We created the configuration. We established connection with an command and control to be able to emulate data exfiltration. So you're now not only looking at your web application firewall is a way in, your firewall, or your endpoint controls, you're also looking at egress on your threat intel and network detection response, your firewall, you name it. Security program holistically end to end. We try to exfiltrate, shadow copy deletion, and tell you how across each one of these steps, we were able to bypass the controls and where it was successful. So the quick call to action that I have for everyone as we kind of get towards the end, and I'll now take all the questions that I'm sorry I wasn't able to do as I was going through the webinar, is try to evaluate whether what we talked about today and how you're approaching and finding and prioritizing your exploitable surface beyond just asset inventory, beyond just yet another way to find vulnerabilities, beyond just a way to find all the exposures, the ones you know, the ones you don't know, how you can take action to actually exploit it in reality, to stress test and harden and prove the impact so you can go about prioritization to your remediation actions while you're eliminating the risk. I'm quickly jumping here. So I talked about the recording. So a quick question I see here on the remediation task, which thank you very much for that. Right now, Pentero, once it's able to pinpoint the root vulnerability, we provide you with the guided remediation to what's the best way. So our team, when we develop an attack, when we develop an exploit, by default, as part of completion of that functionality, we're also going to tell you how to solve it. And once you solve it, how are you going to go about and revalidating to make sure that what you did, solve it, and that vulnerability exposure doesn't exist anymore. So that's a critical question for you to understand. It's not just finding you the information, it's all the way to guided remediation, the context you need, how to do it, and how to validate it once more. Around, I see here, will it work on a direct flow, external to internal? Something that's important to highlight, and I skipped the slide just because of time. I got too excited early on when we talked about the topic. Pentera, the way it operates, have zero human intervention in between. That entire flow that I described, from an asset discovery, from finding the asset and the vulnerability, to progressing the attack. Once we find other assets, how can we privilege escalation? How can we get context? How can I laterally move? How can I, if it's a web application, how can I go and start OWASP top 10 types of exploitation on that, yada, yada, yada. Everything is happening in a complete autonomous fashion. There is no policy to configure. There's nothing you can take action. You do have the capabilities to configure, whether you want Pantera to do it all or you want it to be per approval. That's okay. We understand this confidence needs to be built, but for the majority part, all of our customers are doing that end-to-end in a complete autonomous fashion, auto-approving everything because they want to really get the real picture of the attack landscape against their environment and their security readiness. Exploit payloads belong to Pantera. All the exploits that we use are proprietary. We will never take off the shelf because we don't know whether those can harm the assets that we're actually taking action on. We have our research team, which is one of the largest teams that I've found in the industry, that are proofing in a production grade environment all of these exploits. And these are not exploits about the Pantera homegrown, and we have everything from a critical vulnerabilities to multiple ways how we can bypass SMB controls or remote desktop. It doesn't matter. As for 0 days, right now, there was a huge chatter in the past with this recent vulnerability that was discussed on the 0 days. We, per se, don't have 0 days, but it's important to highlight. We don't believe that 0 days as is what we should be focusing on. And basically what I'm saying is, if you have a 0 day, does it mean you need to leave everything and focus on that? No, because yesterday was Log4j. 2 months ago, it was the MS Exchange one. We look at things in a holistic fashion and based on the proven impact and the root cause. So the way we operate, the techniques that we used are definitely proprietary to Pantera. We build our own way, whether it's an enhanced Nmap of the organizations, an enhanced way of how we do the scanning and the exposure and the protocol analysis. So that's kind of a way for me to kind of double click to that question. 0 days is not just the goal. It's sometimes over focusing on 0 days, shift the focus from the real exploitable attack surface. It's just yet another indicator along the way. I see questions about the agents and footprint on the on-premise host. There is 0 actions that you need to take prior to Pantera being deployed. Pantera don't use any agents for its internal type of attack surface, or for the exposed, everything is happening seamlessly on the outside. The only thing we need to be provided with is a domain name, whether your domain is pantera.com, and we do the rest from there, from a discovery, from dark web analysis, from network identification, from all the assets that's relevant, subdomains, IPs, and whatever of that sort. I see here on the cloud infrastructure, the question was on Azure AD, but Azure AD is one aspect. One of the key things we look from on the cloud infrastructure is, yes, we can help. Because what we're seeing today, especially with the Azure AD, which the question was originated from, is how can from the on-premises we see lag into the cloud infrastructure, especially in this hybrid state, and what the attack patterns of Azure passwords, of how can that be compromised, as well as AD on the on-premises or Azure AD. AWS infrastructure. So definitely we can help with cloud infrastructure as well, and across multiple types of options and techniques that we do. More than happy to follow up on that offline if you want. Okay, everyone, this is we're on top of the hour. I really appreciate you kind of hopping on this webinar. And right before we finish, I love doing this. It gets me excited. I feel like I'm a defender as part of the community. I enjoyed myself, but I want to make sure if this is something that you guys appreciate and you think the content is valuable, give me honest feedback. I can take it because we're going to give you more of this content available. And we want to make sure that your time is well spent. So appreciate if you can give us this final feedback on the session we had today with the talk track on the exploitable attack surface. Helped you in my world, what's it called? Take immediate action right after this webinar. So thank you again. I'm very happy that, we got 54% that loved it, and some that want more technical and some want strategic guidance. I can assure you that the upcoming webinars will take this feedback into heart. This was critical to me. Thank you very much. Have a great day and stay well. Thank you very much.